The milk bucket handle bit into Grace Jensen's palm as she trudged through pre-dawn darkness toward the barn, her breath forming small clouds in the cold Montana air. She had been doing this alone for 3 months now, ever since her father died and left her the ranch outside Desdemona, and every morning felt lonelier than the last. The weight of 22 years pressed on her shoulders as heavily as the responsibility of keeping the failing ranch alive, but she refused to sell the land her family had worked since 1872. It was 1885 now, and Grace knew she had to make this work or lose everything her parents had built. The barn door creaked open, and Grace struck a match to light the lantern hanging just inside. The familiar smell of hay and livestock greeted her as 3 cows shifted in their stalls, recognizing the sound of her footsteps. She set the bucket down and pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The September mornings were getting colder, hinting at the harsh winter ahead. Grace grabbed the 3-legged stool and positioned herself beside Bessie, the oldest and gentlest of her small herd. As her hands worked in the familiar rhythm of milking, Grace let her mind wander to the problems mounting like storm clouds. The fence along the eastern pasture needed repair before winter. The roof of the main house leaked in 2 places. She owed money at the general store in town, and Mr. Peterson had been patient but wouldn't wait forever. Her nearest neighbor, the widow Thompson, had suggested more than once that Grace should find a husband, that a woman alone couldn't manage a ranch. But Grace had seen too many women lose themselves in marriage, become shadows of who they once were. She would rather fail on her own terms than succeed under someone else's thumb. The milk streamed into the bucket in steady rhythms, and Grace found the sound soothing despite her worries. She had just finished with Bessie and was moving to the 2nd cow when she heard footsteps outside the barn. Her heart jumped into her throat. It was barely past 5 in the morning, still dark outside. No honest person had business on her property at this hour. Grace stood slowly, looking around for something to defend herself with. Her father's rifle was in the house, useless to her now. She grabbed a pitchfork leaning against the wall just as a tall figure appeared in the barn doorway, silhouetted against the lantern light. "I am not looking for trouble," a deep voice said, hands raised to show he was unarmed. "I saw your light and wondered if you might spare some water for my horse." Grace kept the pitchfork raised, though her arms were already trembling. "Water pump is outside. Help yourself and move on." The man stepped closer, and Grace could see him better now. He was tall and lean, with dark hair that needed cutting and several days of stubble on his jaw. His clothes were dusty from travel, and he looked exhausted. But it was his eyes that made Grace hesitate. They were a striking hazel color, and they held a sadness that reminded her of her own reflection in the mirror. "Thank you kindly," he said, but he did not move toward the door. Instead, he looked at the cows, then back at Grace. "You are doing this alone." "That is none of your concern," Grace said, though she lowered the pitchfork slightly. Something about this stranger did not seem threatening, just worn down by the world. He nodded slowly. "You are right. I apologize for my intrusion." He turned to leave, then paused. "My name is Wyatt Sullivan. I have been riding for 2 days straight, and I am looking for work. Ranch work specifically. If you know of anyone hiring in these parts, I would appreciate the information." Grace studied him carefully. He looked honest enough, and God knew she needed help. But hiring a drifter was risky, and she barely had enough money to feed herself, let alone pay a ranch hand. "Most of the big spreads are north of here, closer to Helena," she said finally. "The Thompson place might need someone, though you would have to ask them come morning." Wyatt Sullivan nodded again, touched the brim of his hat in a gesture of respect, and walked out into the darkness. Grace stood there for a long moment, listening to the sound of his boots on the hard, packed dirt, followed by the soft sounds of a horse drinking from the pump. She shook her head and returned to her milking, trying to ignore the strange flutter in her chest. She did not need complications, and a drifter cowboy was nothing but complications. But as she worked, Grace could not stop thinking about those sad hazel eyes. She wondered what had put that look in them, what had driven him to be riding alone before sunrise. She finished the milking and carried the heavy buckets back to the house as the first hints of dawn painted the eastern sky pink and gold. The stranger and his horse were gone, and Grace told herself she was relieved. She spent the day doing the endless tasks that ranch life demanded. She mended the fence as best she could, though she knew her repairs were temporary at best. She fed the chickens, collected eggs, and worked in the vegetable garden, pulling up the last of the summer squash before the frost could claim it. By the time sunset painted the sky, her back ached and her hands were raw, but she felt the satisfaction of a day's hard work completed. That night, Grace lay in bed in the room that had been her parents', staring at the ceiling and listening to the wind whistle through the gaps in the walls. She thought about Wyatt Sullivan and wondered where he had ended up sleeping. The nights were cold now, and she hoped he had found shelter. Then she scolded herself for caring about a stranger who would surely be miles away by now. She was wrong. The next morning, when Grace walked to the barn in the pre-dawn darkness, she found Wyatt Sullivan already there. He had lit the lantern and was checking the hooves of one of her cows. Grace stopped in the doorway, her bucket handle forgotten in her hand. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice sharper than she intended. Wyatt looked up, and in the golden lantern light she saw exhaustion etched into every line of his face. "I slept in your hay loft. I hope you do not mind. I tried the Thompson place and 2 others, but no one is hiring. I will move on today, but I wanted to help with the milking first, as thanks for the water and shelter." Grace should have been angry. She should have ordered him off her property. Instead, she found herself walking into the barn and setting down her bucket. "You do not owe me anything." "Maybe not," Wyatt said, "but I believe in paying my debts." He gestured to the stool. "You take Bessie. I will handle these 2, unless you would rather I left." Grace looked at him for a long moment. Every instinct told her to be cautious, to protect herself and her property. But there was something genuine in his offer, something that spoke to a loneliness that matched her own. "Have you milked cows before?" she asked instead. A small smile crossed Wyatt's face, transforming it entirely. "Grew up on a farm in Missouri. I reckon I remember how." They worked in companionable silence, the only sounds the rhythmic streams of milk hitting the buckets and the soft movements of the cows. Grace found herself stealing glances at Wyatt, noting the practiced way his hands worked, the gentleness he showed the animals. He was younger than she had first thought, probably not much older than her own 22 years, though hard living had aged him. When they finished, Wyatt carried the buckets to the house without being asked. Grace hesitated on the porch, knowing she should thank him and send him on his way. Instead, she heard herself saying, "Have you eaten?" Wyatt set the buckets down carefully. "Not since yesterday morning." Grace sighed, knowing she would regret this but unable to stop herself. "I have eggs and biscuits, not much, but you are welcome to share." She saw something shift in Wyatt's eyes, a crack in the careful walls he had built around himself. "That is very kind of you, Miss Jensen, Grace Jensen." She pushed open the door. "And it is not kindness. I just do not like the thought of anyone going hungry." Inside the small kitchen, Grace prepared a simple breakfast while Wyatt sat at the rough wooden table her father had built. She could feel his eyes on her as she worked, and it made her nervous in a way she could not quite name. When she set the plate before him, he bowed his head briefly before eating, and she noticed his hands trembled slightly as he picked up the fork. "When did you last sleep properly?" Grace asked, sitting across from him with her own smaller portion. Wyatt looked up, surprised by the direct question. I am not entirely sure. 3 days ago, maybe 4. He took another bite, clearly trying not to eat too quickly despite his hunger. I have been traveling for a while now. Where are you heading? Anywhere there is work. He met her eyes. I had a ranch in Wyoming. Lost it 2 years ago when my father died and the bank called in his debts. I have been drifting since, looking for a place to start over. Grace understood that pain all too well. My father died 3 months ago. Heart gave out while he was working the fields. He left me the ranch, but also his debts. I'm trying to hold on, but it gets harder every day. They sat in the growing morning light, two strangers bonded by similar sorrows. Wyatt finished his meal and carried his plate to the wash basin. I should be moving on. Thank you for the food and the kindness, Miss Jensen. I hope things work out for you and your ranch. Grace stood, her mind racing. She knew this was foolish, that she was letting her loneliness cloud her judgment. But she also knew she desperately needed help, and something in her gut told her Wyatt Sullivan was trustworthy. I cannot pay you much, she said quickly, before she could change her mind. Just room and board and a small wage when I can manage it, but if you are willing to work hard, I could use the help. Wyatt turned slowly, his expression carefully neutral. Are you offering me a job? I am offering you a chance, Grace corrected. Same as you are giving me a chance by trusting I will keep my word. We can try it for a month and see how it works. If either of us wants out before then, no hard feelings. She saw him struggle with the decision, pride warring with necessity. Finally, he nodded. A month trial. And I will earn my keep, Miss Jensen. You have my word on that, Grace, she said. If we are going to be working together, you might as well call me Grace. Grace, Wyatt repeated, and the way he said her name made something warm bloom in her chest. Thank you for taking a chance on me. They shook hands, her small calloused palm disappearing into his larger one. The touch was brief and professional, but Grace felt the warmth of it long after he had let go. The following days fell into a rhythm that surprised Grace with its ease. She woke before dawn, as always, but now when she reached the barn, Wyatt was already there with the lantern lit. They milked the cows together, working side by side in the quiet of early morning. At first they barely spoke, but gradually conversation began to flow. Grace learned that Wyatt was 24 and had lost his mother when he was 12. His father had remarried a woman who resented his presence, and Wyatt had spent most of his teenage years working the ranch alone, while his father tried to please a wife who could never be satisfied. When his father died, the stepmother had wasted no time in selling everything and disappearing, leaving Wyatt to deal with the angry creditors. In turn, Grace told Wyatt about her own life. She was an only child, born late to parents who had almost given up hope. Her mother had died when Grace was 18, and she had spent the last 4 years helping her father run the ranch. He had taught her everything he knew, treating her like the son he never had. She had loved him fiercely, but his death had left her completely alone in a world that had little patience for independent women. As the days passed, Grace noticed changes around the ranch. The fence she had been struggling with was repaired properly. The leak in the roof was patched. Wyatt fixed the door on the chicken coop that had been hanging crooked for months. He worked from dawn until long after dark, often by lamplight, and he never complained. Grace tried to pay him in other ways, cooking larger meals and making sure he had blankets enough for the cooling nights. She had set him up in the small bunkhouse her father had built years ago when they had hired seasonal help. It was drafty and sparse, but Wyatt seemed grateful for it. 2 weeks into their arrangement, Grace woke one morning to find snow dusting the ground. She dressed quickly and hurried to the barn, worried about the animals. Wyatt was already there, as usual, but this morning he had done something different. He had brought in extra hay and covered the gaps in the barn walls to keep out the wind. The cows were warm and content, and a fire burned in the small stove in the corner. "I hope you do not mind," Wyatt said when he saw her looking around. "I used some lumber I found behind the bunkhouse. We need to keep them warm if we want them producing milk through the winter." "It is perfect," Grace said softly. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not a drifter or a stranger but a man who cared about her ranch as much as she did. "Thank you, Wyatt." He smiled, and Grace realized it was the first real smile she had seen from him. It transformed his entire face, erasing the sadness she had seen that first morning. "We should start every day together anyway," he said. "Might as well make it comfortable." Something in the way he said it made Grace's heart skip. She busied herself with the milking to hide her reaction, but she could not stop thinking about those words. Start every day together. It implied a future, a permanence that both thrilled and terrified her. As October gave way to November, the first real snow came. Grace woke one morning to find the world transformed, everything covered in a blanket of white. She dressed warmly and made her way to the barn, her boots crunching in the fresh snow. Inside, Wyatt had everything prepared as always. But this morning he had also brought a thermos of coffee from the bunkhouse. "I figured we could both use something warm," he said, pouring some into a tin cup and handing it to her. Grace wrapped her hands around the cup, grateful for the warmth. "You did not have to do this. I wanted to." Wyatt poured his own cup and leaned against the barn wall. "Grace, I want to talk to you about something." Her heart sank. She had known this was coming. A month had passed, and Wyatt was probably ready to move on. She had been foolish to hope he might stay. "If you want to leave, I understand," she said quickly. "You have done so much already, and I am grateful." Wyatt looked confused. "Leave? No, that is not what I was going to say." He set down his cup and faced her fully. "I want to stay, Grace. Permanently, if you will have me. This ranch, working with you, it is the first time in 2 years I have felt like I have a home. I know our arrangement was temporary, but I am asking if we can make it permanent." Relief flooded through Grace so strongly she felt dizzy. "Yes," she said. "Yes, of course you can stay. I cannot imagine doing this without you anymore." They smiled at each other, and in that moment, something shifted between them. Grace realized with startling clarity that what she felt for Wyatt had moved far beyond gratitude or friendship. She was falling in love with him, with his quiet strength and gentle nature, with the way he treated her as an equal and never questioned her capabilities. But she kept these feelings locked inside. Wyatt had not indicated he saw her as anything more than an employer or friend, and she would not risk losing him by admitting her heart's truth. Winter deepened, and with it came new challenges. A blizzard in December trapped them inside for 3 days. Grace insisted Wyatt stay in the main house rather than risk the journey to the bunkhouse, and he slept on the floor near the fireplace. Those 3 days, trapped together in the small house, felt both eternal and far too brief. They talked for hours, played card games with her father's old deck, and cooked meals together. Grace learned that Wyatt loved to read, that his favorite color was the blue of the sky just before sunset, that he had a small scar on his hand from a childhood accident with a fence post. When the storm cleared and Wyatt returned to the bunkhouse, the house felt emptier than it ever had before. Grace found herself making excuses to see him during the day, to bring him extra coffee, or ask his opinion on ranch matters she could have decided herself. If Wyatt noticed, he did not comment, but she saw the way his eyes followed her when he thought she was not looking. Christmas came, and Grace invited Wyatt to share Christmas dinner in the house. She made her mother's recipes, dishes she had not prepared since her father died. Wyatt brought her a gift, a book of poetry he had bought on a trip to town. She had gotten him new work gloves, having noticed his old ones were worn thin. They sat by the fire that night, reading poetry aloud and laughing at the silly romantic verses. But some of the poems were not silly at all, and when Wyatt read one about a man's devotion to the woman he loved, Grace felt tears prick her eyes. The new year of 1886 arrived with brutal cold, the kind that made every breath burn in your lungs. But no matter how cold it was, Grace and Wyatt still met in the barn before sunrise. It became the best part of Grace's day, those quiet hours working side by side while the rest of the world slept. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they worked in comfortable silence, but always Grace felt a sense of rightness, of being exactly where she was meant to be. In February, disaster struck. One of the cows, the youngest, became ill. Grace spent 2 days and nights in the barn, trying to save her, and Wyatt never left her side. They took turns holding the animal's head, speaking soft words of comfort, doing everything they could. But on the third morning, the cow died. Grace broke down then, all the stress and fear and exhaustion of the past 6 months overwhelming her. She sobbed in the cold barn, grieving not just for the cow but for her father, for the constant struggle, for the loneliness that never quite went away. And Wyatt held her, pulling her into his arms and letting her cry against his chest. He stroked her hair and murmured that everything would be all right, that they would get through this together. When Grace finally calmed, she pulled back, embarrassed by her breakdown. But Wyatt kept his hands on her shoulders, his eyes intense. "Grace, you do not have to do this alone anymore. I am here and I am not going anywhere. Do you understand?" She nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat, but something in his eyes made her brave. "Why are you still here, Wyatt? Really?" He was quiet for a long moment, his hands still warm on her shoulders. Then he said, "Because I love you, Grace Jensen. I have loved you since that first morning when you faced me down with a pitchfork, brave and fierce and beautiful. I love the way you work until your hands bleed rather than give up. I love your strength and your stubbornness, and the way you sing to the chickens when you think no one is listening. I am here because there is nowhere else I would rather be than by your side." Grace's heart felt too big for her chest. "I love you too," she whispered. "I have been so afraid to say it, afraid you would leave if you knew." Wyatt pulled her close again, and this time when he held her, it was different. This was not comfort for a friend, but the embrace of a man holding the woman he loved. Grace wrapped her arms around his waist and held on tight, feeling like she had finally come home after a long journey. When they pulled apart, Wyatt cupped her face in his hands. "May I kiss you?" Grace nodded, and then his lips were on hers, gentle and sweet and perfect. It was not her first kiss, but it was the first one that mattered, the first one that made her understand what all the poems and stories were about. When they finally broke apart, both were smiling. "We should probably finish the milking," Grace said, laughing a little. "Probably," Wyatt agreed, but he kissed her again anyway. They finished their work in a haze of happiness, stealing kisses between tasks like teenagers. When they walked back to the house together, Wyatt held her hand, and Grace felt lighter than she had in months. They sat at the kitchen table, making plans and dreaming out loud about the future. "I want to marry you," Wyatt said suddenly. "I know I do not have much to offer. I have no money, no land of my own, but I love you, Grace, and I promise I will work every day for the rest of my life to make you happy." Grace reached across the table and took his hand. "You have already made me happy, and this ranch, it is ours now. We will build our future together as equals and as partners." "Is that a yes?" Wyatt asked, hope shining in his eyes. "Yes," Grace said. "Yes, I will marry you, Wyatt Sullivan. They married in March in a simple ceremony at the small church in Desdemona. The widow Thompson and her family attended, along with a few other neighbors who were surprised but pleased to see Grace had found someone. Grace wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her smaller frame. Wyatt wore his best shirt, freshly pressed, and when he saw Grace walking toward him, his eyes filled with tears. The ceremony was brief, the words traditional, but when Wyatt slipped a simple gold band on Grace's finger and promised to love her all his days, she knew she was making the right choice. They kissed as husband and wife, and the small congregation applauded. They returned to the ranch that afternoon, now truly their home together. Wyatt moved his few belongings from the bunkhouse into the main house, into the bedroom that would now be theirs. That night, as man and wife, they began their life together in every sense, their love tender and passionate and full of promise. Spring came with renewed hope. Wyatt used some of the money Grace had been saving to buy 2 more cows and some chickens. They planted a larger garden, working side by side to prepare the soil. Grace loved watching Wyatt work, loved the way his muscles moved beneath his shirt, loved the concentration on his face as he carefully placed each seedling. They developed new routines as a married couple. Every morning, they still met in the barn before sunrise to milk the cows together. But now Wyatt kissed her good morning first, wrapping her in his arms and holding her close for a moment before they started their work. These quiet morning hours became sacred to Grace, a time when the world was theirs alone. In May, Grace realized she was pregnant. She had suspected for a week or two, but had not wanted to say anything until she was sure. When she finally told Wyatt, he picked her up and spun her around, laughing with pure joy. Then he set her down carefully, as if she were made of glass, and asked if she should be doing heavy work in her condition. Grace laughed and swatted his arm. "I am pregnant, not broken. Women have been working through pregnancy since the beginning of time. I will tell you if I need to rest." But Wyatt could not help himself. He took over the heaviest tasks, insisted she sit when he thought she had been on her feet too long, and fussed over her until Grace wanted to throttle him and kiss him at the same time. She bore it with as much grace as she could, knowing his worry came from love. As her belly grew, so did the ranch's prosperity. The garden flourished, providing vegetables they could eat fresh and preserve for winter. The cows were healthy and producing well. They were even able to start paying down the debt at the general store. Mr. Peterson, seeing how hard they both worked, had become more patient, and he congratulated them heartily when he heard about the baby. Summer was full and warm, and Grace spent her evenings sitting on the porch with Wyatt, watching the sun set over their land. Wyatt would rest his hand on her growing belly, talking to the baby about the ranch and the life they would build together. Grace fell in love with him more deeply every day, amazed at the gentle father he would be. In September, just as the leaves were beginning to turn, Grace went into labor. It was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next day. Wyatt held her hand and wiped her forehead with cool cloths, never leaving her side despite her screams and curses. The widow Thompson came to help, having delivered several babies in her time. Finally, in the late afternoon of the second day, Grace gave birth to a healthy baby boy. The moment the baby's first cry filled the room, Grace began to weep with exhaustion and joy. Mrs. Thompson cleaned the baby and placed him in Grace's arms, and Grace looked down at the tiny, perfect face in wonder. "He has your eyes," she told Wyatt, who was kneeling beside the bed, his own eyes wet with tears. "But your stubbornness, I am certain," Wyatt said, gently touching the baby's tiny hand. "What should we name him?" Grace had thought about this for months. "Thomas," she said, "after my father, Thomas Jensen Sullivan. Wyatt kissed her forehead. Perfect. He is absolutely perfect, just like his mother. The first months with baby Thomas were exhausting in a way Grace had not anticipated. She was up several times a night to feed him, and the days blurred together in a haze of dirty diapers and constant laundry. But Wyatt was there through it all, walking the floor with Thomas when he cried, changing diapers without complaint, taking over the morning milking entirely so Grace could sleep a little longer. On mornings when Thomas slept in, Grace would join Wyatt in the barn anyway, unwilling to give up their time together. She would nurse Thomas while Wyatt milked, the baby content in her arms, and they would talk quietly about their dreams for the future. "I want to expand the herd next spring," Wyatt said one morning. "With the money we are saving, we could buy 3 or 4 more cows. If we can build up a good dairy operation, we could sell milk and butter in town." Grace nodded, watching Thomas's eyes drift closed as he finished nursing. "And I want to start selling eggs regularly. Mrs. Thompson says the hotel in town is always looking for suppliers." They planned and dreamed, building their future one careful decision at a time. The ranch slowly transformed from a struggling operation into a thriving small farm. It was not easy, and there were setbacks, like the late frost that killed half their garden or the chicken that fell prey to a fox. But together, Grace and Wyatt weathered every storm. Thomas grew from a tiny infant into a chubby, happy baby. His first smile was for Grace, but his first laugh was for Wyatt, who had been making silly faces to try to cheer him during a fussy evening. By his first birthday, Thomas was toddling around the ranch, following his father like a small shadow. Grace loved watching Wyatt with their son. He was patient and playful, never too busy to stop and answer Thomas's babbled questions or pick him up for a cuddle. It reminded Grace why she had fallen in love with him in the first place, his fundamental kindness and gentle strength. As 1887 became 1888, the ranch continued to prosper. They paid off the debt at the general store and even had enough saved to make improvements. Wyatt built a proper dairy shed and a larger chicken coop. Grace started a small orchard, planting apple and cherry trees that would bear fruit in years to come. Life settled into a rhythm of work and love, of quiet satisfactions and simple joys. Every morning, Grace and Wyatt still met in the barn before sunrise, sometimes with Thomas on Grace's hip, sometimes with him still sleeping in his crib. These mornings remained their special time when they could talk without interruption and simply be together. One morning in early spring, as they worked side by side, Wyatt said, "Do you remember that first morning when I asked you for water?" Grace smiled. "How could I forget? I thought you were a desperado coming to rob me." "I was so tired and lost," Wyatt continued. "I had been drifting for so long, and I had just about given up hope of ever finding a place to belong. And then I saw the light in your barn, and something told me to stop." He set down his bucket and took Grace's hands in his. "I thank God every day that I listened to that voice. You saved me, Grace. You gave me a home and a family and a reason to wake up every morning with joy in my heart." Grace felt tears prick her eyes. "You saved me too. I was so lonely, so afraid I would lose everything. And then you appeared, and suddenly I was not alone anymore. We saved each other." Wyatt pulled her close, and they stood there in the barn, holding each other while the cows shifted peacefully in their stalls. "Let's start every day together," he whispered into her hair. "For the rest of our lives, let's start every day together just like this. Always," Grace promised. "Every single day." By the summer of 1889, Grace was pregnant again. This pregnancy was easier than the first, perhaps because she knew what to expect, or perhaps because Thomas was old enough to be entertaining himself more. In December, she gave birth to a daughter they named Margaret, after Wyatt's mother. Margaret had Wyatt's dark hair and Grace's blue eyes, and she was the most peaceful baby Grace had ever seen. Thomas, now 3 years old, was fascinated by his baby sister. He would sit beside her cradle and talk to her in his garbled toddler speech, telling her about the chickens and the cows and everything he found important. Grace's heart swelled watching her children together, seeing the family they had built. The ranch continued to grow. By 1890, they had 10 dairy cows, 3 dozen chickens, and a small herd of pigs. They hired seasonal help during the busiest times, young men from town looking for work. Wyatt proved to be a fair and patient boss, teaching the hands the right way to do things and treating them with respect. Grace started selling butter and eggs regularly in town, developing a reputation for quality products. Women would ask specifically for Jensen Sullivan dairy goods, and Grace felt a fierce pride in the business they had built. The ranch that had been failing when her father died was now thriving, a testament to hard work and stubborn determination. Life was not without its difficulties. Thomas got sick with pneumonia when he was 4, and for 3 terrifying days, Grace and Wyatt took turns sitting by his bedside, praying he would pull through. When the fever finally broke, Grace sobbed with relief, and Wyatt held both her and Thomas, his own face wet with tears. There was a drought in the summer of 1891 that killed half their vegetable garden and made the well run dangerously low. They hauled water from the creek 2 miles away, Wyatt making trip after trip with the wagon while Grace rationed every drop. But they survived, and when the rains finally came in September, they stood outside and let themselves get drenched, laughing like children. Through every challenge, they faced it together. Grace had learned that marriage was not about one person being stronger or smarter, but about 2 people working as a team, supporting each other's strengths and covering each other's weaknesses. She and Wyatt were partners in the truest sense, and their love had only deepened with time. In 1892, Grace became pregnant for the 3rd time. She was 30 years old now, and this pregnancy exhausted her more than the previous 2. Wyatt insisted she rest more, taking over many of her daily tasks. Grace protested but secretly appreciated his care. In May, she gave birth to another son, whom they named Jacob after her grandfather. With 3 children and a growing ranch, life became a beautiful chaos. Grace often found herself standing in the middle of their land, watching Wyatt work with the cattle while Thomas and Margaret played nearby and baby Jacob napped on a blanket, and feeling such profound gratitude that she could hardly breathe. This life, this family, this love, it was everything she had ever wanted, even when she had not known to want it. The years flowed by like the creek that ran through their property, each season bringing its own joys and challenges. Thomas grew into a serious boy who loved working with the animals like his father. Margaret was spirited and curious, constantly asking questions and getting into mischief. Jacob was the peacemaker, gentle and thoughtful, always trying to smooth over his sibling squabbles. Grace and Wyatt watched their children grow with wonder and not a little amazement that these small people were theirs. They attended school in town, making friends and learning their letters and numbers. But they also learned from the ranch, understanding the value of hard work and the responsibility that came with caring for animals and land. Every morning, through all the changes and growth, Grace and Wyatt still met in the barn before sunrise. Sometimes the children came with them now, Thomas helping with the milking and Margaret collecting eggs while Jacob played in a safe corner. But no matter who else was there, those early morning hours remained special, a time when Grace and Wyatt connected and remembered the foundation on which their life was built. On their 10th wedding anniversary in 1896, Wyatt surprised Grace with a new ring. It was simple but beautiful, with a small diamond that must have cost him dearly. He slipped it onto her finger beside the gold band he had given her a decade earlier and said, "10 years ago, I promised to love you all my days. That promise has only grown stronger. You are my everything, Grace Sullivan." Grace kissed him, not caring that the children were watching and giggling. "And you are mine. The best decision I ever made was giving that desperate cowboy a chance all those years ago." Wyatt laughed. "I was desperate, was not I? Half-starved and filthy from traveling. But your eyes were kind," Grace said softly. "I saw that right away, even when I was trying to be fierce and independent." "You were fierce," Wyatt assured her. "You still are, my brave, fierce, beautiful wife." They held each other while their children made exaggerated gagging sounds at their parents' mushiness. Grace and Wyatt just laughed, used to their children's reactions to displays of affection. Grace knew they were lucky their parents still loved each other so openly. She had known too many couples who grew cold and distant over the years. She and Wyatt had made a conscious choice to never let that happen, to always remember why they had fallen in love, and to nurture that love like they nurtured their land. As the century drew to a close, the ranch was more successful than Grace had ever imagined it could be. They had nearly 20 dairy cows now, a substantial chicken operation, and pigs that provided income from selling piglets to other farmers. The orchard Grace had planted years ago was bearing fruit, and she sold preserves and pies in town. They had paid off all debts and even had money saved for emergencies and future improvements. But more important than financial success was the life they had built. The house that had once echoed with loneliness now rang with laughter and conversation. The land that Grace had nearly lost was now thriving, cared for by two people who loved it and each other. Their children were healthy and happy, growing up knowing they were loved and valued. In the spring of 1900, as the new century dawned, Grace stood in the barn before sunrise, waiting for Wyatt as she did every morning. She was 37 now, her hands more calloused, her hair showing threads of silver. But she felt more alive than she had at 22, when she had been struggling alone and terrified of losing everything. Wyatt came in, now 39, and showing his own signs of age lines around his eyes, gray in his dark hair. But to Grace, he was as handsome as the day she had first seen him in the lantern light, asking for water and looking lost. "Good morning, my love," Wyatt said, kissing her as he did every morning. "Good morning," Grace replied, wrapping her arms around him for a moment longer. "Hard to believe it has been 15 years since you first walked into this barn." "Best 15 years of my life," Wyatt said. He pulled back and looked at her seriously. "Grace, I want to tell you something I have never properly said. Thank you for taking a chance on me. Thank you for seeing past the drifter to the man who just wanted a home. Thank you for building this life with me. I could not have done any of it without you." Grace felt tears well up, the good kind that came from overwhelming love. "We did it together. That is what made it work. Not you or me alone, but us together." They kissed again, a long, sweet kiss that held 15 years of partnership and love. When they pulled apart, Wyatt said, "Let's start every day together. That is all I have ever wanted, and that is all I will ever need." "For the rest of our lives," Grace promised. They began their morning routine, working side by side as they had for so many years. The sun began to rise, painting the Montana sky in shades of pink and gold. In the distance, Grace could hear the children beginning to stir in the house. Soon they would come running to the barn, full of energy and questions and ready to start their own days. But for now, it was just Grace and Wyatt, together in the quiet of early morning, two people who had found each other when they both needed it most. They had built a life from nothing but love and hard work, and Grace knew that whatever challenges the future might bring, they would face them together. As she watched Wyatt work, Grace thought about that desperate cowboy who had asked for water all those years ago. She thought about the lonely, scared girl she had been, trying to run a ranch alone. Those two people seemed like different lives now, like characters in a story she once read. But their story was real, and it was beautiful, and Grace was grateful every single day that she had let Wyatt Sullivan into her barn that cold September morning. He had asked for water, but he had given her so much more love, partnership, family, and a future brighter than any she could have imagined. The years continued to pass, marked by the changing seasons and the steady rhythms of ranch life. Thomas turned 18 in 1905, a young man now with his father's height and his mother's determination. He had become invaluable on the ranch, able to handle most tasks as well as Wyatt. But Thomas had dreams beyond Desdemona. He wanted to study agriculture at the new college in Bozeman, to learn modern farming techniques and bring that knowledge back to improve the ranch. Grace and Wyatt encouraged him, despite the ache of knowing their oldest would be leaving home. They had saved money for this purpose, wanting their children to have opportunities they never had. When Thomas left for school that fall, Grace cried in Wyatt's arms, mourning the loss of her baby even while being proud of the man he had become. Margaret, now 16, was proving to be a talented artist. She drew the ranch, the animals, the mountains in the distance, her family. A teacher in town had encouraged her talent, and Margaret talked about going to art school in Helena. Grace loved her daughter's spirit and creativity, even when it meant Margaret sometimes forgot her chores to sketch a particularly beautiful sunset. Jacob, at 13, was the one most likely to stay on the ranch permanently. He loved the land with a deep, quiet passion that reminded Grace of her father. He could spend hours working with the animals or walking the property, and he was always finding ways to improve their operations. Grace and Wyatt knew that the ranch would be in good hands with Jacob whenever that time came, but that time was still far off. Grace was only 42 and Wyatt 44. They were in the prime of their lives, experienced enough to be wise but young enough to work hard. The ranch was well established now, a respected operation that had weathered economic downturns and harsh weather and all the unpredictable challenges of agricultural life. Every morning, without fail, Grace and Wyatt still met in the barn before sunrise. It had become such an ingrained habit that Grace sometimes woke automatically, her body knowing it was time even before her mind fully registered waking. And every morning, Wyatt was there, waiting with a smile and a kiss and the quiet companionship that had sustained them through 15 years of marriage. One morning in the spring of 1907, as they worked together, Wyatt said, "Do you remember what I said to you that first morning I helped with the milking?" Grace smiled. "You said something about starting every day together." "I said we might as well start every day together," Wyatt corrected gently. "It was almost a question, like I was testing the waters to see if you would accept me being around." "And here we are, still starting every day together," Grace said. 22 years later. "Best decision I ever made," Wyatt said. "Second only to asking you to marry me." They finished their work and walked back to the house hand in hand, watching as the sun rose over their land. The morning air was crisp with the promise of spring, and Grace could see green shoots beginning to appear in the garden. Another season, another year, another cycle of growth and harvest. Inside, they found Margaret already in the kitchen, making breakfast. She had become an accomplished cook, often taking over meal preparation so Grace could focus on other tasks. Jacob was setting the table, yawning and rumbling something about it being too early for civilized people to be awake. Grace and Wyatt exchanged amused glances, remembering when they had felt the same way about their parents' habits. "Mother, father," Margaret said as she served eggs and bacon, "I have been thinking about what I want to do after I finish school." Grace poured coffee for herself and Wyatt, then sat down. "And what have you decided?" "I want to go to Helena," Margaret said, "to study art. But I also want to come back here eventually. I want to paint Montana, our ranch, the life we have here. I want to show people the beauty of this place through my art." Grace felt a lump in her throat. "That sounds wonderful, sweetheart." Margaret looked at her father. "Do you think I am foolish to want to make art instead of something practical?" Wyatt reached across the table and squeezed his daughter's hand. "I think you would be foolish not to follow your passion. Your mother and I will support whatever you want to do as long as it makes you happy." Jacob looked up from his breakfast. "Does this mean I get your room when you leave?" Everyone laughed, the moment of seriousness broken by teenage practicality. Grace looked around the table at her family and felt such overwhelming love that her chest ached with it. This was what mattered, not the size of the herd or the money in the bank, but these people, this love, this life they had built together. Summer came, hot and dry, testing their irrigation systems and their patience. But the ranch had weathered worse, and they had learned from years of experience. The family worked together, everyone contributing according to their abilities. Even Margaret, who would rather be drawing, put in long hours helping with the harvest. In August, Thomas came home from college for a visit. He was taller somehow, more confident, full of ideas about crop rotation and new breeding techniques for dairy cattle. Wyatt listened to everything his son said, asking questions and considering carefully. Grace loved watching them together, her husband and her son, discussing the future of the ranch as equals. One evening, as the family sat on the porch after dinner, Thomas said, "I have been thinking about my future, about what I want to do after I graduate." Grace felt her heart skip. "And what have you decided?" "I want to come back here," Thomas said simply. "I love learning at school and I am grateful you gave me that opportunity. But my heart is here on this land. I want to help expand the ranch, to use what I have learned to make it even better. If you will have me, that is." Wyatt's eyes were suspiciously bright. "Son, nothing would make us happier. This ranch will be yours and your siblings someday. We have always hoped you would want to continue what we started." "What grandmother and grandfather started," Thomas corrected. "What you and mother built. What our whole family has worked for. That legacy matters to me." Grace stood and hugged her son, this young man who had once been a tiny baby, in her arms. "We are so proud of you, Thomas, so incredibly proud." The evening ended with talk of the future, of expansion plans and new techniques, of preserving the past while embracing progress. Grace sat beside Wyatt, his arm around her shoulders, and felt the rightness of it all. Their children would carry on what they had started, adding their own chapters to the family story. That night, lying in bed beside Wyatt, Grace said, "Did you ever imagine it would turn out like this? When you walked into my barn that morning asking for water," Wyatt pulled her close. "I did not imagine anything. I was too tired and lost to think beyond the next day. But if I had been able to imagine a future, I could not have dreamed up anything better than what we have." "Me either," Grace whispered. "Me either." The years continued their steady march forward. In 1908, Margaret left for art school in Helena, and the house felt emptier without her vibrant presence. But she wrote long letters describing her classes and her adventures in the city, and she came home for holidays with new sketches to show. Grace framed several of Margaret's paintings of the ranch and hung them throughout the house, proud of her daughter's talent. Thomas graduated from college in 1909 and returned home permanently, bringing with him new ideas and boundless energy. He and Wyatt worked together to implement modern techniques, and the ranch prospered even more. Thomas proved to be a natural leader, able to manage the hired hands while still maintaining the respect and fairness his father had taught him. Jacob, meanwhile, quietly became the heart of the daily operations. While Thomas focused on innovation and expansion, Jacob kept things running smoothly, ensuring the animals were cared for and the basic work was done. He had a gift for knowing what needed to be done before being asked, and Grace often told Wyatt that Jacob was the most like her father of all their children. In 1910, at the age of 23, Thomas met a young woman named Sarah Miller at church. She was the daughter of a rancher from the next county over, visiting her aunt in Desdemona. Grace watched her son fall in love with the same headlong intensity Wyatt had shown all those years ago. By the end of the year, Thomas and Sarah were engaged. They married in the spring of 1911, and Sarah came to live on the ranch. Grace had worried about how she would feel having another woman in her home, but Sarah was sweet and hardworking, eager to learn and respectful of the ways Grace had established. They developed a warm relationship, more like mother and daughter than the traditional tense dynamic between mothers-in-law and daughters-in-law. By the end of 1911, Sarah was pregnant, and Grace was going to be a grandmother. The news filled her with a strange mix of emotions: joy at the new life, wonder at her own aging, nostalgia for when her children were small. But mostly joy. Always joy. Wyatt teased her about being too young to be a grandmother. "We are not old enough for this," he protested, though his eyes shone with happiness. "We are 48 and 50, Grace reminded him. "We are plenty old enough." "But we still meet in the barn before sunrise every morning," Wyatt said. "That keeps us young." And it was true. Despite the years, despite the silver in their hair and the lines on their faces, Grace and Wyatt still maintained their morning ritual. Some days it was just the two of them, like in the old days. Other days Thomas joined them, learning from his father's experience. But always, Grace and Wyatt started their day together, and that rhythm sustained them through everything. In May of 1912, Grace's first grandchild was born, a healthy baby girl Thomas and Sarah named Emma Grace, after both grandmothers. When Sarah placed the baby in Grace's arms, Grace looked down at the tiny face and felt her heart expand yet again. She thought of her own mother, who had never lived to see Grace's children, and felt grateful that she was here for this moment. Wyatt stood beside her, looking at his granddaughter with wonder. "She is beautiful," he said softly. "Just like her grandmother," Thomas said with a grin, making Grace laugh even as tears ran down her face. Life on the ranch adjusted to accommodate the new generation. Emma's cradle was placed in Thomas and Sarah's room in the house that was growing crowded but warm with family. Grace taught Sarah to make butter and preserve vegetables, passing on the skills her own mother had taught her. Wyatt showed Thomas how to repair equipment and judge the health of cattle at a glance, generations of knowledge flowing from father to son. Margaret came home from Helena for the summer of 1912, now a sophisticated young woman of 23. She had finished art school and was making a name for herself with paintings of Montana landscapes. But she was also engaged to a teacher named David Chen, who had come to Montana from California to work at a school for immigrant children. Margaret brought him home to meet the family, nervous but determined. Grace knew some families would object to their daughter marrying outside their race, but she and Wyatt had never believed in judging people by their origins. David was educated, kind, and clearly devoted to Margaret. That was all that mattered. Wyatt shook David's hand firmly and welcomed him to the family, and Grace saw the relief and gratitude in her daughter's eyes. "Thank you," Margaret whispered to her mother later. "I was so afraid you might object." Grace hugged her daughter. "All I have ever wanted is for you to be happy and loved. David clearly makes you happy, and he treats you with respect. That is everything." Margaret and David married in the fall of 1912 in a small ceremony in Helena, with the whole family traveling to attend. They settled in Helena, where David continued teaching and Margaret painted. But they visited the ranch often, and Margaret's paintings of her childhood home became some of her most popular works. As 1913 dawned, Grace found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. She was 50 years old, a grandmother surrounded by a large and loving family. The struggling ranch she had inherited was now a thriving operation, respected throughout the region. Her children were grown and making their own way in the world, but they remained close, united by bonds of love and shared history. And through it all, there was Wyatt, her partner, her love, her best friend. They had weathered every storm together, celebrated every victory together, and built a life that exceeded both their wildest dreams. One morning in early spring, as they met in the barn before sunrise as always, Grace stopped Wyatt before he could begin work. "I want to tell you something," she said. Wyatt set down his bucket immediately, giving her his full attention as he always did. "What is it?" "I was just thinking about that first morning you came here," Grace said. 28 years ago. I was so lonely and scared, and I had almost given up hope that things would ever get better. And then you appeared, like an answer to a prayer I had not even known to pray." Wyatt took her hands in his. "I was lost, and you gave me a home. You gave me everything." "No," Grace said softly. "We gave each other everything. That is what made it work. We were both broken in different ways, and we helped each other heal. We were both lost, and we found our way together." She looked into his hazel eyes, still as beautiful as they had been that first morning. "You said we should start every day together, and we have, every single day for 28 years. That has been my favorite part of our life together, those quiet morning hours when the world is just ours." "Mine too," Wyatt said. He pulled her close, and they stood together in the barn as they had countless times before, holding each other as the world slowly woke around them. "Let's start every day together for the rest of our lives," Wyatt said, echoing the words he had spoken so many years ago. "Always," Grace promised. "For however many days we have left, we will start them together." They kissed, a sweet kiss full of 28 years of love and partnership and devotion. Then, hand in hand, they began their morning work. Two people who had found in each other exactly what they needed, exactly when they needed it most. The years that followed were full and rich. In 1914, Thomas and Sarah had a son they named Wyatt Thomas Sullivan, ensuring the family name would continue. Jacob, now 22, began courting a young woman from town named Emily Foster, and they married in 1915. Emily was practical and hardworking, and she fit into the ranch family as if she had always belonged. Jacob and Emily built their own small house on the ranch property, near enough to be part of daily life but far enough for privacy. In 1916, they welcomed twin daughters, and the ranch seemed to overflow with children and laughter and life. Grace often found herself surrounded by grandchildren, reading them stories or teaching them to feed the chickens, and she marveled at how full her life had become. Margaret and David had a son in 1917, a beautiful boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's artistic spirit. Though they lived in Helena, they visited often, and Grace treasured every moment with all her grandchildren. The ranch continued to grow and prosper. Thomas's modern methods combined with Wyatt's experience and Jacob's dedication created an operation that weathered economic uncertainties and changing markets. They diversified, adding sheep to their cattle and dairy operations, and began breeding horses as well. The Jensen Sullivan Ranch became known throughout Montana as a model of successful family farming. But all the success in the world meant less to Grace than the fact that her family was healthy and happy. She watched her children raise their own children with love and patience, passing on the values she and Wyatt had worked so hard to instill. She saw the respect her sons and sons-in-law showed their wives, the partnership model she and Wyatt had lived proving its worth in the next generation. Through everything, the constant was her morning time with Wyatt. Even as they aged, even when winter made the walk to the barn difficult, they maintained their ritual. Some days they did less actual work, their aging bodies no longer as strong as they once were. But they were always there together, starting each day side by side. In 1920, Grace and Wyatt celebrated their 33rd wedding anniversary. The family threw a party, gathering from near and far to celebrate. Thomas stood and made a toast, his voice thick with emotion. "To my parents," he said, raising his glass. "You taught us what love looks like. Not the easy, romantic kind, though you have that too, but the hard, everyday kind. The kind that shows up in the barn before dawn even when you are tired. The kind that works side by side through drought and illness and loss. The kind that never gives up, never stops choosing each other, every single day. Thank you for that example. We are all better people because of it." Grace looked at Wyatt through tears and he squeezed her hand. All around them, their children and grandchildren raised their glasses, a testament to the life they had built. Grace thought about that scared girl she had been at 22, alone and struggling. She could never have imagined this future, this abundance of love and family. As the celebration wound down and the family began to leave, Grace and Wyatt walked out to look at their land in the moonlight. The ranch spread before them, buildings and fences marking years of hard work and dedication. "We did well," Wyatt said softly. "We did," Grace agreed. She leaned against him, and his arm came around her as naturally as breathing. "Better than well. We built something that will last beyond us. Our children and grandchildren will carry on here and they will remember us." "Not just remember," Wyatt said. "They will live the values we taught them. Love, partnership, hard work, respect. Those things matter more than the land or the buildings. Those are our real legacy." Grace nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. They stood together in the quiet night. Two people who had found each other when they most needed finding, who had built a life from nothing but love and determination, and the willingness to start each day together. The 1920s brought change to the world, but life on the ranch maintained its steady rhythms. Grace and Wyatt were in their late 50s now, still active but beginning to slow down. Thomas and Jacob had taken over most of the daily operations, with Wyatt serving more as an advisor than an active participant. Grace had passed on most of the household management to Sarah and Emily, though she still maintained her morning routine in the barn. Some mornings, Wyatt suggested she stay in bed, rest her aging joints, but Grace always refused. "I have been meeting you in the barn before sunrise for more than 30 years, she would say. "I am not stopping now." And so they continued, two people joined not just by marriage but by habit and choice and deep, abiding love. Their hair was silver now, their steps slower, but the connection between them was as strong as ever. They held hands as they walked, steadied each other when the path was uneven, and found joy in the simple fact of being together. In 1925, as Grace turned 62 and Wyatt 64, they decided to take a trip. It was something they had talked about for years, but never done, always too busy with the ranch. But now, with the ranch in capable hands, they took the train to San Francisco to visit Margaret and David and their growing family. The city amazed and overwhelmed Grace, so different from the wide spaces of Montana. But she loved seeing where her daughter lived, meeting her grandchildren's friends, and watching Margaret in her element as an acclaimed artist. David took them to his school, and Grace was moved by the work he did, teaching immigrant children and helping them adjust to their new country. But after 2 weeks, both Grace and Wyatt were ready to go home. The city was exciting, but Montana called to them. When they stepped off the train in Desdemona and saw Thomas waiting with the wagon, Grace felt her heart settle. This was home, these wide skies and endless horizons, the ranch where she had spent her entire adult life. "Did you enjoy your trip?" Thomas asked as they rode home. "Very much," Grace said, "but it feels good to be home." Thomas smiled. "The ranch was not the same without you. It felt wrong not seeing you and Father in the barn every morning." Back home, Grace and Wyatt resumed their routines with relief. The morning after their return, they met in the barn before sunrise, and Grace felt a sense of rightness settle over her. This was where she belonged, in this barn with this man, starting another day together. "I love you," she said to Wyatt, not for the first time but never for the last time. "I love you too," Wyatt replied, as he had countless times before and would countless times again. They worked together in comfortable silence, the only sounds the familiar ones of milk streaming into buckets and cows shifting in their stalls. Outside, the sun began to rise, painting the Montana sky in shades of pink and gold. Another day was beginning, and Grace and Wyatt were beginning it together, as they always had and always would. The years that followed were gentler, quieter. Grace and Wyatt became the beloved grandparents, always ready with a story or a treat, their wisdom sought by the younger generations. They watched their grandchildren grow, seeing their own traits reflected in these young faces. Emma, now a teenager, had Grace's determination. Young Wyatt had his grandfather's gentle nature. Jacob's twins were as inseparable as their parents were devoted. In 1930, as the country entered the Great Depression, the ranch faced new challenges. Money became tight, and many neighboring ranches failed. But the Jensen-Sullivan Ranch survived, thanks to careful management and decades of experience. They had weathered hard times before, and they weathered this storm too, the family pulling together as they always had. Grace and Wyatt, now in their late 60s, provided not just wisdom but comfort during the difficult years. They had lived through hard times before, and they could assure the younger generations that persistence and hard work would see them through. And slowly, gradually, the worst of the Depression passed, and the ranch stabilized again. In 1935, Grace and Wyatt celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary. It was a grand affair, with family coming from across Montana and beyond. Margaret arrived from Helena with her family. Relatives Grace had not seen in years made the journey. The celebration lasted 2 days, filled with food and music and stories. On the actual anniversary, as the party wound down, Grace and Wyatt slipped away to walk the ranch alone. They moved slowly now, their steps careful, but they walked hand in hand as they always had. They stopped at the barn, the place where so much of their life had unfolded. 50 years, Wyatt said wonderingly. Sometimes it feels like just yesterday. Other times it feels like we have always been together. Both are true, Grace said. She looked up at him, this man who had been her partner for half a century. His face was deeply lined now, his hair completely white. But his eyes were the same hazel that had captured her heart all those years ago. You are still the cowboy who asked for water that first morning. And you are still the brave woman who faced me down with a pitchfork, Wyatt said with a smile. The woman who took a chance on a drifter and changed his life forever. We changed each other's lives, Grace corrected. That was always the beauty of it. We met when we both needed someone, and we built something neither of us could have built alone. Wyatt cupped her face in his weathered hands. Let's start every day together, for however many days we have left. Always, Grace promised, as she had promised so many times before. They kissed, a gentle kiss full of 50 years of love and devotion and partnership. Then, slowly, they walked back to the house full of their family, their legacy, the life they had built from nothing but love and hard work, and the willingness to face each new day together. The late 1930s brought new joys. More great-grandchildren arrived, and Grace delighted in these youngest members of the family. She was a great-grandmother now, a concept that still amazed her. The baby born to Thomas and Sarah's daughter Emma seemed like a miracle, this new life connecting her to yet another generation. Grace and Wyatt's health began to fail slowly, the inevitable decline of age. Wyatt developed arthritis that made his hands stiff and painful. Grace's knees grew weaker, and stairs became a challenge. But still, every morning they made their way to the barn. The family offered to take over to let them rest, but Grace and Wyatt refused. "This is what keeps us alive," Grace explained to Thomas one day. "Starting each day together, maintaining our routines. The day we stop is the day we truly become old." So the family supported them, making sure the path to the barn was clear, that lanterns were lit, that everything they might need was close at hand. And every morning, no matter the weather or how they felt, Grace and Wyatt met in the barn before sunrise, two old people clinging to the ritual that had sustained them for more than 50 years. In the spring of 1940, Wyatt had a heart attack. It was mild and he recovered, but it scared everyone. The doctor said he needed to rest, to take things easy. Wyatt agreed, but on one condition. He would still meet Grace in the barn every morning, even if he could not do heavy work. And so they continued, their morning routine adapted to their changing abilities. They sat together on hay bales while Thomas or Jacob did the actual milking. They watched the sunrise through the barn doors, Grace's hand in Wyatt's, content simply to be together. One morning in June, as they sat together, Grace said, "Do you have any regrets?" Wyatt considered the question. "Just one," he said finally. "I wish I could live it all over again. Every day with you has been a gift and I want more of them." Grace leaned her head on his shoulder. "Me too. But we have been so blessed, Wyatt, so many years together, such a beautiful family, a good life. Many people never get what we have had." "I know," Wyatt said. "And I am grateful for every moment. Especially these moments, these quiet mornings with you. They have always been my favorite part of every day." "Mine too," Grace whispered. They sat together in the barn as the sun rose. Two people who had loved each other for more than 50 years, who had built a life and a legacy that would continue long after they were gone. The sounds of the ranch waking up surrounded them, grandchildren calling to each other, the movements of animals, the everyday music of the life they had created. In 1942, Grace became ill. It started as a bad cold that would not go away, then developed into pneumonia. She was in bed for weeks, tended by her daughters-in-law and visited constantly by her worried family. Wyatt barely left her side, sleeping in a chair beside the bed, holding her hand through fever dreams. Grace recovered slowly and incompletely. She was weaker after, her energy depleted. The doctor said her heart had been strained by the illness. She needed to rest, to take things easy. Grace nodded and agreed, but she insisted on still going to the barn every morning. The family set up a comfortable chair for her there, with blankets and cushions. Wyatt helped her walk the short distance, both of them moving slowly but stubbornly. They would sit together in the barn, watching as their sons and grandsons did the work, content simply to be present, to maintain the tradition that had defined their life together. On a cold morning in January 1943, as Grace and Wyatt made their way to the barn through fresh snow, Grace stopped suddenly. Wyatt turned, concerned, but she was smiling. "What is it?" he asked. "I was just thinking," Grace said, "about that first morning you came here. You asked for water, and I was so scared and suspicious. If someone had told me then that 58 years later we would still be walking to this barn together every morning, I would never have believed them." "Best water I ever asked for," Wyatt said, making Grace laugh. They continued to the barn where Thomas had everything prepared. The cows were already milked, but Grace and Wyatt sat in their chairs anyway, wrapped in blankets, watching the sunrise through the open door. "Thank you," Grace said suddenly. Wyatt looked at her questioningly. "For choosing me," she clarified. "For staying, for building this life with me, for every single morning in this barn. Thank you for loving me so well." Wyatt's eyes filled with tears. "You chose me first. You gave me a chance when you had every reason not to. Everything good in my life came from that moment. I am the one who should be thanking you." "Then we will thank each other," Grace said, "for a life well lived together." They held hands and watched the sun rise. Two old people at the end of a long journey, grateful for every step they had taken together. Grace passed away peacefully in her sleep in April of 1943, at the age of 80. She had spent the evening surrounded by family, holding her newest great-grandchild, smiling at the continuation of life. Wyatt had been beside her, as always. When he woke in the morning and found her gone, he held her hand for a long time, saying goodbye to the love of his life. The funeral was large, with people coming from all over to pay their respects. Grace had touched many lives in her 80 years, and the stories shared painted a picture of a strong, loving, determined woman who had built something lasting. Her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren gathered around Wyatt, supporting him in his grief. The morning after the funeral, Wyatt made his way to the barn before sunrise, as he had done for 58 years. Thomas found him there, sitting in his chair, tears streaming down his face. "Father," Thomas said gently, sitting beside him, "you do not have to do this anymore." "Yes, I do," Wyatt said. "We promised to start every day together. She may be gone, but I can still keep that promise. I can still come here and remember and feel her presence." And so he did. Every morning for the remaining months of his life, Wyatt made his way to the barn before sunrise. He would sit in his chair, Grace's empty chair beside him, and watch the sun rise. Sometimes he talked to her, sharing thoughts and memories. Sometimes he just sat in silence, feeling her presence in the familiar space where they had spent so many hours together. Wyatt died in October of 1943, 6 months after Grace, at the age of 82. Thomas found him in the barn one morning, sitting peacefully in his chair, a small smile on his face. The family believed he had simply decided it was time to join Grace, that living without her had become too difficult. They buried Wyatt beside Grace on a hill overlooking the ranch, with a simple stone that read, "Grace Jensen Sullivan and Wyatt Sullivan." They started every day together. The ranch continued, passed to Thomas and Jacob and their families, then to the next generation and the next. The barn where Grace and Wyatt had spent so many mornings together became almost sacred, a place where family history was shared and memories preserved. Grandchildren and great-grandchildren heard the story of how Grace and Wyatt met, how they built the ranch from nearly nothing, how they loved each other through more than 50 years of marriage. The tradition of starting each day in the barn before sunrise continued through the generations. Parents brought their children there, teaching them the value of hard work and dedication, telling them about their ancestors who had worked in this same space. The barn was maintained carefully, preserved as a connection to the past. Years later, when Emma Sullivan Morgan was an old woman herself, she brought her great-granddaughter to the barn early one morning. As they sat together watching the sunrise, the little girl asked about the pictures of the old people on the wall. "Those are my grandparents," Emma said. "Grace and Wyatt Sullivan. They started this ranch together, built it from almost nothing. And every morning for more than 50 years, they met in this barn before sunrise to milk cows and start their day together." "Every morning?" the little girl asked, amazed. "Every single one," Emma confirmed. "Through good times and hard times, through sickness and health, they kept that promise to each other, to start every day together no matter what." "That is a long time," the girl said thoughtfully. "It is," Emma agreed, "but that is what real love looks like. Not just the exciting moments, but the everyday ones. The choice to show up, to work together, to build a life brick by brick, day by day. They taught our whole family what partnership means, what commitment looks like." The little girl looked at the pictures of Grace and Wyatt, two young people whose love had created a legacy that lasted generations. "I want to love someone like that someday," she said. Emma hugged her great-granddaughter close. "Then you will, sweetheart." The story of Grace and Wyatt lives on in all of us. Their love built not just this ranch, but our family. And as long as we remember them and honor what they taught us, that love never dies. As the sun rose fully, bathing the old barn in golden light, Emma smiled. She could almost feel her grandparents' presence, still here in the space that had meant so much to them. Grace and Wyatt were gone, but their love remained, woven into every board of the barn, every acre of the ranch, every heart of the family they had created. They had started each day together for more than 50 years, and in doing so, they had built something eternal. Their story was one of love and partnership, of hard work and dedication, of two people who found each other when they both needed finding and chose each other every single day for the rest of their lives. It was a story worth remembering, worth sharing, worth aspiring to. And in that old barn in Montana, as morning light streamed through the doors, their legacy lived on.